Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 17, Romanticism. Now, Romanticism is kind of a term that's hard to define. It's like an artistic, intellectual, and spiritual movement that started in the German states and then would spread on throughout the rest of Europe and other areas as well. And it was a movement that was greatly influenced by some of the topics that we discussed earlier in the semester. But before we get into Romanticism, I want you to take a moment and think of the proper plural of this animal. Now, I'm not trying to fool you here with some, obscure animal that, I'm not trying to trick you and say this is not anything than an octopus. This is a regular old octopus. So I want you to think about what the proper plural of this animal is. So again, while you're thinking of the proper plural of octopus, I'll give you a second, and while you're thinking about it, you can stare at some of these magnificent creatures using their tentacles as like little legs to run across the ocean floor, because that's amazing. Okay, so now, with that, in the back of your mind, let's try to understand how Romanticism relates to some of our earlier lectures. In many ways, Romanticism can be seen as a reaction against the scientific rationalization of nature. To the Romantics, nature is an awe-inspiring and almost mystical presence. It is also a reaction to the Enlightenment. Remember how during the Enlightenment lecture I called Jean-Jacques Rousseau almost an anti-philosophe? And that was mainly due to his ideas that in order for a person to become a complete person, they needed to use both their mind and their feelings, right? It wasn't just about reason with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Well, Romanticism is going to especially embrace the ideas of the value of feelings. So, Enlightenment, is really heavy on the mind and reason. Romanticism is going to fully embrace the ideas of feelings. Another important thinker who was contemporary with the Enlightenment was Edmund Burke. He was an Irish politician in the United Kingdom, and he was also kind of an anti-Enlightenment thinker. He supported the American Revolution, yet denounced the French Revolution. In 1757, he wrote his only true, solely philosophical work on the beauty and the sublime. And he defined it in this work as like the beautiful draws people in with love and is well formed and aesthetically pleasing. This beauty is often associated with smallness and delicacy, and it has a general calming effect on people. Whereas the sublime compels people with fear and has the power to destroy people. Whereas smallness and delicacy was important to the beautiful, vastness and magnificence are a part of the sublime, and it creates a tension inside of people. So that's kind of what can destroy people. So these ideas of the sublime would be very influential on Romanticism. This overwhelming feelings that can happen. Romanticism is also clearly a reaction to industrialization and the changing landscape. As I mentioned, nature is going to be very important to Romantics, and this is going to be especially true as, cities grow more and more and become more industrialized over time. So Romanticism is kind of a reaction to all of these things. Before we get into, the heart of Romanticism also, we first have to talk about a movement that came along just before of it. And that is this German artistic and literary movement called Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. And the movement gets its name from the title of a Friedrich Maximilian Klinger play, obviously called Sturm und Drang. And the movement occurs in the late 1760s to early 1780s. Sturm und Drang artists were especially interested in the extremes of emotions. And in many ways, this was a response to the controlled rationalism of the Enlightenment. So, in the Enlightenment, you're supposed to use your reason to stay balanced and, think about things clearly. Sturm und Drang was really interested instead in, the extreme states of emotions. And here we see Klinger, actually, after he left Prussia, which was where he's born, and had joined the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. He was actually a general in the Russian army after he left the German state of Prussia. One of the most influential people during the Sturm und Drang movement was Friedrich Gottlieb Klopstock. Klopstock was a poet who really opened the parameters of German poetry by introducing new rhythms and stresses and intonations into his work. And his most famous piece was his Der Messias. Over time, the Sturm und Drang movement began to evolve into what we consider Romanticism. And it's not surprisingly then that Romanticism was still very interested in extreme emotions, right? The extremes in emotions. And just feelings in general, really. Here we can see the French realist painter Gustave Courbet, who created this romantically inspired self-portrait, which has also been titled The Desperate Man. But you can see the intense emotions that he's feeling are being portrayed in this piece of art. And that's really what art was about during the Romantic period. Art really became a tool for expressing feelings, whether it was painting or sculpture or music. And I think if we wanted to put Romanticism if we wanted to define it by a single word, I think the best word to describe it would be passion. Romanticism is all about passion, and that doesn't just mean, passion for good things. This could be passion, you just had to feel things. And then this also included trying to make religion more about an individual's feelings. So during this time, we kind of see a rise in a really, really intense Catholicism over the calmer Lutheranism and Calvinism. A slight increase in that. Nature would also be a major theme in Romanticism. To the Romantics, nature was impressive and awe-inspiring, while also still being a bit frightening, honestly. And this is by the painter Caspar David Friedrich, who we will talk about a little bit later in this lecture. This is also by Friedrich. You can notice how nature just really kind of dwarfs man here, right? I mean, the real player here is nature, and then you just kind of have these secondary figures of humans in there. This is also very typical of a Friedrich, I guess trope is what maybe the term for it, where we're looking over the people's shoulders to the nature behind everything. And we can also see this poor man down here. He seems to have lost his contact lens or something, and the lady's like, "Oh no, I see it down there on the cliffs." Something like that. Maybe that's not exactly what is happening. in Friedrich's painting, but that's how my interpretation goes. The expansiveness of nature is especially evident in this other Friedrich painting. Like I said, he's going to be a very, very important figure during the Romantic era. So we see this tiny little human figure here going off into these dark, intense woods. So, you see the expansiveness of nature, and then you also get that sense of fear or unsettled feeling due to the darkness of that forest, and then the raven sitting there on that stump, kind of watching him. Dramatic elements of nature were often featured in Romantic art. And what I mean by dramatic elements, I mean like things like storms or, dark night or the liminal phases of dusk and dawn. So you kind of get these dramatic elements of nature. It's not just, a sunny field or something like that. Usually there's some intensity going on there. It's often due to the time of day or just the subject itself. We also see a rise in the interest in the supernatural, things like ghosts or vampires or other monsters. Basically anything that could be lurking in the darkness, people were gaining an interest in. The story Frankenstein was actually written during the Romantic period, although Frankenstein is a very, very strange book that obviously is influenced by Romanticism, but at the same time is kind of off on its own. But, the same ideas are there. Here we see a painting of Ossian meeting fallen heroes of, France, and this is by the French painter Girodet. Here's another example of the supernatural, I guess. This is called Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, who was an Anglo-Swiss painter from 1781. But you can see the nightmare, this monstrous nightmare just sitting on top of this very dramatic woman while she sleeps. And then this terrifying thing, which I still don't know what that is. No clue. Similarly, we see an interest in death in general. The supernatural, like ghosts and stuff like that, but also death. Here's Girodet's Malvine dying in the arms of Fingal. And here is a painting, another C.D. Friedrich painting, one of his many paintings of a cemetery. And you get that nice, it appears that workers are on a break while digging a grave. So death is right there for us in this Friedrich painting. So when we talked about the Renaissance, you'll recall that the artists during that were looking towards ancient Greece and Rome, for inspiration. Now, the artists during Romanticism, they found their sources of inspiration in the medieval world. So even though it's called Romanticism, and that kind of sounds like it might be influenced by ancient Rome, no, Romanticism is really more influenced by the medieval world. The German Romantics especially saw this medieval world as a high point for the German people. And so those German Romantics, and German Romanticism in general, was especially concerned with promoting a traditional German past. And now I put German in quotes here because at this time, you got to remember that there is no country called Germany. That wouldn't come around until 1871, which we'll see in our next lecture, actually. Instead of there being a Germany, there were around 40 different German states that existed. So there's really no German, past. There's this culture, I guess. And the Romantic movement is really working to unify people through this shared German culture. And here we can see two paintings by Karl Spitzweg. One of them features a town that would look very similar to how medieval towns looked. This is obviously an idealized town. And then the other, we can see a German couple meeting in the woods in their traditional dress here. The German past, of course, did extend beyond the Middle Ages, and that could be celebrated as well. This is another C.D. Friedrich painting called A Walk at Dusk, and we get an example of, the dramatic time. This is at night, or at dusk, I guess. And this man is strolling along next to an old, Iron Age tomb, thought to be, some type of Germanic hero or tribal leader, something like that. But that's what these pile of rocks are, this old tomb that's been kind of desecrated. And then here is one of it's a sculpture by Rudolf Meisson of the Germanic god Odin. Of course, we get our word Wednesday comes from this, from the same god Odin. And sculpture did exist during the Romantic period, but it was not as big as painting, I suppose. Meisson was one of the major sculptors of this, and here we can see him, at least in this piece, very influenced by the old Germanic traditions, the old Germanic religion, by portraying Odin, the Germanic god. But really quickly, let's return to these figures here, especially these two right here in the forest. These two members of a group that would kind of be called Das Volk, which just kind of meant the common people, were really thought to hold the key to unlocking the German past. And they did this in the way that they lived their lives, their traditional way of living their lives, their stories and their memories, and those were all thought to be pieces of Germanic history. And if you looked at those, you could get a true sense of what it meant to be German and what that German past really was. So what we see are a lot of movements among German scholars and intellectuals to try to collect the knowledge and traditions held by Das Volk, the common people. Two of the major figures who worked for this goal of collecting German knowledge and that past were Occam von Arnim and Clemens Brentano. They were brothers-in-law, and in fact, von Arnim's wife, who was Clemens Brentano's sister, was also a very famous and key figure in German Romanticism, especially as a writer. But these two men together went around collecting German folk songs and poems from the people. And once they had them all collected, they put them all together in a 3-volume set called Des Knaben Wunderhorn. And this literally means like the young man's magic horn or the boy's magic horn. The first volume was published in 1805, the other two in 1808. So this is, to put this in context of everything that's happening, the Industrial Revolution's really starting to pick up steam now. Oh, that's a bad pun there. And this is also right as Napoleon is ruling as emperor in France, just to kind of make sure that we are set in what's going on elsewhere in the world. So that's when these are being published. And this work was incredibly influential and popular. There's a major German scholar and writer named Goethe, and he believed that every household should have a copy of this. Every household in Germany should have, or in the German world should have this. And Brentano would also be very, very important in the collection of another group of German culture, and that's because he requested that a couple of academic brothers collect stories from the people, and make a collection and publish a collection, just as Occam von Arnim and Clemens Brentano had done. And yes, these academic brothers were the Brothers Grimm, both scholars. Wilhelm, you see on the left with that lovely hat, and Jakob there on the right looking, off into nothingness. And they did begin collecting folk tales. And it wasn't by fighting monsters as the Brothers Grimm did in the Terry Gilliam film, but instead it was through something much more exciting and invigorating and dare I say even more thrilling. Yes, I'm talking about studying. How great is that? So through studying the stories, they were able to edit and publish their collection first in 1812. And this would be called Kinder- und Hausmärchen. Literally, it comes off to like children's and domestic wonder tales. Of course, we know them as fairy tales, right? The Grimm brothers' fairy tales, or the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. But I don't know. There's something very lovely about Kinder- und Hausmärchen. There would be 7 editions of their collection, and during these there would be some stories added, some taken away, and by the 7th edition, there were 211 stories in it, and these stories had illustrations as well. And of course, these fairy tales would become very, very well known, but oftentimes they could be a bit darker than some of the Disney versions that you can hear. So we see stories like Cinderella, or as it is in German, Aschenputtel. So this story actually has parallels throughout the world. It's thought that like one of the earliest versions of this was like an ancient Greek story about a Greek slave being married to the Pharaoh of Egypt. But as the story traditionally fits today, that we get it from the Brothers Grimm. And like I said, oftentimes their stories could be a bit darker than what we normally tell our children these days. In the Grimm's version, the stepsisters cut off their toes and like shave parts of their heel so that they can fit into the slipper. And the prince notices when blood is starting to come out of the shoe that maybe they weren't actually his lovely Aschenputtel, which he doesn't know that that's who that is yet. So it's not quite the same as the Disney version that many of us grew up with. There's also, of course, Sneewittchen, or Snow White. We can see there she is with the 7 dwarves. But in the end of the Grimm's version, the queen, the wicked queen, becomes so enraged that Snow White is marrying the prince that she actually chokes and dies at the ceremony because she's so upset. That's how enraged she is, that she chokes and dies. in her anger. And of course, who could forget the great tale of von dem Mauschen, Wildchen und der Bratwurst, or, the mouse, the bird, and the sausage. This is actually my favorite Brothers Grimm tale, because it's a lovely little tale where we see these three things living together, and in order to do so, they all have their jobs, right? They all contribute in the way that they best can. For example, the mouse gathers water and sets the table, and here we can see him setting the table. The bird gets firewood from the forest. There's the bird with the firewood. And then the sausage cooks. That seems fair, right? That's obviously what the type of jobs that they would all have. But one day, they all decide that the others have it way too easy, so they all decide to change jobs up. The sausage goes out to gather wood, and is pretty much immediately eaten by a dog. The bird tries to get water, but it falls in a well and drowns. And then the mouse doesn't really know how to cook, so it decides that, the only way that it's seen cooking done is by cooking like the sausage. So it decides to cook like the sausage does, and so he jumps into the pan and starts rolling around to stir, and then he dies by cooking himself. So, so this is it doesn't work out too well, the changing of jobs. And basically, I really love this story because it has this very nice little moral of know your place, right? I mean, how else could you interpret this? They all want to change their lives, but they all die as a result. So it's just kind of sure, it's don't be jealous or don't think that others have easier, but no, this is really about know your place, do your duty, right? Don't go striving to do something else. That seems to be the main moral of that story. The two brothers also are much less known for this work, but it's very, very important. They started a German dictionary called the Wörterbuch, which literally means the word book, because that's how German works. And it's very similar to the Oxford English Dictionary, if any of you are familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary. And now I only say they started this because they began it in 1838, began studying and putting it together, and it wasn't completed until 1961. So many other scholars had to finish the work that they had started. And then there were words still being added to it, much like in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. So this is another very important work that they did, and here we can see actually there's the first copy from 1854. I said they started in 1838. They didn't get even the beginning of it published until 1854. Jakob Grimm, so one of the Grimm brothers, Jakob, was also incredibly important in the development of the field of linguistics. He, in fact, has a law named after him. It's called Grimm's Law, and that's because he recognized that there was a sound shift from Proto-Indo-European, that big language that all of these different Indo-European languages came from. So he noticed that there was a sound shift from that into the Proto-German, the early German, that would eventually become, German, Dutch, English, Scandinavian, those type of Germanic languages. So this is, like I said, a major development in the field of linguistics, and it's something that I think people should know more about. He's really, most know him just for fairy tales, but this law is very important. We can see here is some example of Grimm's law, with the consonants and how it's working. So we see the T in early Indo-European becomes this TH. That's the symbol for a TH. So the Latin tertius, or the Greek trios, becomes third in English, which is a Germanic language. And similarly, with in mater in Latin, which would become like madre, or in Spanish, we see mother, right? The T becomes a TH there. Similarly, we see like a D becomes a T, a K becomes this, eventually an H sound, so you have the Latin word for dog, canis, which in Greek is kuon, become hund in German, or hound in early English. And now, this is the final one I'm going to talk about, is the P to the F change. So the Latin pes for foot, and you can think about pied in French, pied in Spanish, becomes, or in Greek it's also pus. That will become fus in German, or foot in English. So we can kind of see that there, the P to the F. And with this pus to fus thing, we can also now finally start to answer the very, very important question that I posed to you at the beginning of this lecture. Maybe the most important question in our lives, if I'm not being too dramatic there. And that is, like I said, the one that I posed at the beginning of the lecture. So we see that the pus in octopus actually comes from the Greek word for foot. So pus is contracted down, the O slips away. So this is a Greek word here, not Latin. So octopus is not Latin, it's a Greek word. So the proper plural of it definitely cannot be octopi. So if you thought it was octopi, no. No, no, no. Instead, the proper plural should be octopodes, since podes is the Greek plural of foot. Pus podes is the Greek plural of their foot. So, of course, there are going to be people who tell you that language is dynamic and always changing, so why does it really matter? I mean, if we want to say octopi, then that's right. No, 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 it's not. Don't let this Latin-looking ending deceive you. It's not Latin, it's Greek, so it should be octopodes. There you go. So now, whenever you hear someone say octopi, no. You can tell them, no, it's not right. So, carry that with you. Again, like I said, possibly the most important thing we may ever learn. Probably not, but that's okay. Okay, now back to Romanticism after that impressively silly tangent. One of the most important and influential painters in the Romantic period is Caspar David Friedrich, who we've seen many of his paintings so far. You can see his dates. He lived from 1774 to 1840. Yeah, and like I said, we've seen quite a few of his paintings already in this lecture. You'll remember A Walk in the Dusk, where that guy was walking by the old Iron Age hero tomb. We also saw the one where the guy lost his contact, right? And the lady was trying to help point that it was down there. No. But yeah, so that's C.D. Friedrich, and this is perhaps one of his most famous pieces. It's called A Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, and you can see again how the audience is looking over the shoulder of the person who's in it. So really, nature is taking center stage here, and it really emphasizes how magnificent and powerful nature feels when you just have these like little humans who are there, but are kind of dwarfed by the natural world around them. And here is a self-portrait that Friedrich made of himself, obviously. And it must have been the period of time when he was really trying to audition for the role of Wolfman. I mean, look at those sideburns. That is ridiculous. And those eyebrows. Yeah, he was definitely trying out for the role of Wolfman. But that's a figure that we should really know as an artist. Look back on this, on the other slides of this lecture for some of his other famous paintings, because, like I said, one of the most influential of this period. Now, in terms of music, before the Romantic period, composers were closely tied to their patrons. And remember how we saw artists were very tied to their patrons during the Renaissance? This remained the case, especially for music. So, classical composers early on were closely tied to their patrons and really under the control of them. And that obviously was members of the nobility and the church as well. This is actually a little picture that someone has made of a 6-year-old Mozart playing for members of the church. Now, in the Romantic period, composers really began to break free from the control of patrons. Instead, they were able to have more freedom to write what they wanted to, make money that way. They didn't just need it coming from one source, who then, obviously demanded what the composer would write. Instead, they could kind of like shop around, like almost like little mini entrepreneurs, really. So a greater freedom there. And the composers then of Romanticism really used this freedom to create more and more complex music, I guess is a good term for it. Music with different complexity to it. So they built upon elements of previous composers, and they added more texture by adding variety to the accompanying parts. And they also would stretch out movements of pieces, which gave more opportunities for diversity, more opportunities to feature that variety of accompanying parts. And that's just among some of the many changes that were developing in music at this time. The emotional expression of Romanticism, remember how we talked about the extremes of emotions were very, very important. Well, that was made a lot easier as a newer instrument became more and more popular. And this instrument was the forte piano, which replaced the harpsichord. And this is actually a harpsichord that we see here. And the harpsichord made it sound by, when you press the key, a string would be plucked. And we can see there's the little plectrum there that plucks the string, so when you press the key, it goes down and, strikes the string. Because the sound came from a string being plucked, it didn't really last very long. It wasn't a very full, rich sound, and it kind of would, evaporate really quickly. So when using a harpsichord, composers often filled a lot of space with many different notes, because each one was short, right? The notes wouldn't be able to last, so what you kind of did was you just added a lot of notes quickly. In contrast, the forte piano produced its sound differently, and so here we see the forte piano. When a key was pressed, a tiny little hammer or mallet would hit the string, and here we can see there's that little tiny mallet. And this meant that the sound could be sustained and would resonate longer, and so you didn't really need long runs of notes. That isn't to say people wouldn't still use them, but you didn't need them. And perhaps the most famous composer of this time was Ludwig van Beethoven. He started his career on the harpsichord, but over time he would switch over to the forte piano as he realized the benefits that you could do with it. And then with the forte piano, he was able to create a fuller and more expressive sound in many ways. So let's take a little listen to some of the differences. We'll start with one of Mozart's most famous sonatas, the Rondo alla Turca, and this is going to be on a harpsichord. So yeah, you can kind of hear how the sound is kind of twangy and a little bit thinner, coming from the harpsichord. So Mozart, in this case, really filled it up with a lot of, many different notes and these runs of notes played very quickly. So now let's kind of contrast that with one of Beethoven's most well-known sonatas, the Moonlight Sonata. And this is going to be played on a forte piano. So yeah, you can hear how Beethoven was able to make these slower, lingering lines that had this really full and rich sound to them, and how using that he had the ability to express different emotions with it. As a result of this newer instrument. Now that isn't to say that Beethoven wouldn't add, runs of fast notes. Like I said, he began his career on a harpsichord, so he was certainly capable of it. And in fact, in this same song, the third movement really shows that he was fine still doing that, as you can hear. Now. So yeah, Beethoven still could do those long runs, but even those had a little bit of a different feel because of the forte piano. Now, the arts weren't the only area that was deeply influenced by Romantic ideas. Many other movements were movements that had like a social aspect to them. Um, you'll remember the search for German identity and culture that we saw in the Romantic movement really led to a rise in nationalism in Germany, and then from Germany it would spread on to different areas as well. You know, people being um, proud of where they live, and like I said, at its best, nationalism is a love for your country, but at its worst, it's kind of a feeling that you and your country are superior to others. So, you know, there's some good aspects of nationalism, but in its most extreme, there are some certainly there are some negatives. And like I said, the Germans were not the only ones to have this strong sense of nationalism. Really, once nationalism develops, it spreads throughout the world. In England, the liberals, who we talked about already, the ones who were working for the workers' rights, trying to make these legal changes, often were very influenced by Romanticism, and the views of Romantic intellectuals. In France, a man named Charles Fourier developed this idea of utopianism. And basically, he wanted society as we knew it to be overthrown so that people could then create small communal societies where within these a wealth of a person would be determined by the job that they had. So, I mean, if you were a farmer, you would get paid less than, another type of job. But people in all those different levels would be paid the same. This society also would then have no trade because Fourier thought it was an evil practice. He thought trade was the root of all evil. He also believed that women should be able to hold the important jobs if they could do them. Basically it was based on merit, not gender, which is a really, like right up there with, well, not really Rousseau, but like right up there with the stronger ideas of the Enlightenment. Here by, being influenced by Romanticism, he was also has this idea of women being, their worth being based on their merit. Didn't have quite the same view when it came to certain groups of people. As I said, trade was considered the root of all evil to him, so he generally had a disfavorable opinion of Jewish people, and he thought it would be best if all the Jews were forced to work in the fields. So not a great, not a favorable outlook at all there. And in fact, some utopian communities did arise from Fourier. Even in the United States, there were these communities, little utopian communities, but basically everywhere they failed. Karl Marx took this idea of communalism a bit further in developing socialism and communism. These are all things that are developed through Karl Marx's ideas. And Karl Marx basically saw history as a series of struggles between the haves and the have-nots. Remember when we looked at the rise of the merchant class at the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance? Marx defined this as a revolution of the bourgeoisie, who were the have-nots, overthrowing the nobility, who, the people who owned all the land. And then, thus, the bourgeoisie became the haves, right? As soon as they overthrew the nobility, they gained what the nobility had once had. This brought along a new class struggle. This was, especially with the Industrial Revolution, we see a new group arise in the have-not section, and these are the workers of those factories who are called the proletariats. So now we see the bourgeoisie are the haves, and the proletariats are the have-nots. So this is the next in the series of struggles between those haves and have-nots. Now we have the bourgeoisie versus the proletariats. And Marx envisioned that the proletariats would overthrow the bourgeoisie, and this would actually be the final revolution in humankind. And after this, people would live communally and equally while sharing everything, in this perfect world, because everybody had what they needed. But really, Marx's view of history is just way, way, way too simplistic. There's not just a have and have-nots, and we'll get into this a little bit in another lecture this semester. But there certainly isn't just one group of haves and one group of have-nots, and they're violently opposed to each other. Eventually, people would use this simplistic view that Karl Marx had. They would adapt it to their own agendas and really pervert many of his ideas that he had laid out originally in his work Das Kapital, and then use them for their own benefits. And thus we see, the communism in practice, this perversion of Karl Marx's ideas. So with that, we'll end the Romanticism. In our next lecture, we're going to look at a bunch of different revolutions that are going to happen throughout Europe, in response to the Enlightenment, in response to Romanticism, the whole situation after Napoleon. We're going to see how Europe kind of sorts its way out through many different revolutions. But that's for the next lecture. This is Greg, signing off.